So this project is a very long time coming, and it definitely had its fair share of bumps in the road along the way. This was a very odd shaped slab, and I thought the best way to make the most out of it would be to make a circular table. The easiest way to make a shape of infinite sides is using a circle jig, but I don't have any of those. So I made my own out of a dollar scrap of melamine, and it worked perfectly. This piece will later be used as the base of the mold. Once I had that cut out, I could use it to help in this step, the layout. You can see from this shot here that the slab kind of looks like this, and I needed it to look like this. So what I'm doing here is figuring out what pieces from the slab are going to go where in that circle, which I'm doing all in my head, which is kind of dumb. You can do this in your head for a standard slab and epoxy table, since those are a rectangle with a mostly rectangular slab or two. So the layout basically is determined by how much epoxy you want to use. What I should have done here is taken a picture of the slab and used Photoshop to play with it like a puzzle, kind of like what I did for the previous animation. Could have saved myself about 3 hours, but hindsight's 20/20. All that to say, I spent a very long time planning the layout for this piece. I didn't want to make any cuts before I knew for certain that's what I wanted to do. Because you know what they say, measure once, cut twice, or something like that. So now for the fun part, getting all dusty. Before doing any sort of epoxy pour, you've got to clean up all the rotted ends, the dust, the dirt, or else all that is going to end up in your epoxy. Or worse, the epoxy won't adhere to the wood. So that's all I'm doing now. So I had said at the beginning this project was a long time coming. I bought this slab in 2022 on a whim and had other projects going on at the time. Plus, I just met this random girl who I had no idea was going to be my wife at the time, so you can guess I was a little distracted. So basically what I'm saying is, this is all my wife's fault. Either way, I was in California, and believe it or not, woodworking is not my full-time job. I'm in the military, and in 2023 ended up getting long-awaited orders. So I convinced this girl I was dating to agree to marry me and move across the country, and then the military did its thing, boxing everything up, breaking a bunch of stuff along the way, and dumping it off over in Maryland for us to try to figure out...
Who's Trey, and why do we have his topper?
So, ta-da! New shop, new house, new side of the country, all is well. However, we still haven't figured out who Trey is. So I thought I was saving myself a bunch of time by putting a tarp over the piece as it dried, since when I moved, something I did lose was a dust-free space to pour epoxy. I absolutely should have known better than to do this, because with 5 minutes of using my brain, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Or at least happen when it dries. Cliffhanger. So, if you see anything, if you see anything along here, let me know.
And you'll do what?
Panic. Turns out I should have been panicking about something else. But it's fine. Ignorance is bliss. At this point in the video, I'm a happy 10-year-old kid. I still want to be a professional baseball player when I grow up. Money spits magically out of a machine my parents stop at a couple times a week, and I have no idea what taxes are. So right now, everything is going swimmingly. The depth of this pour is well within the limits of this epoxy, and I have my trusty assistant helping scrape nagging bubbles off the burl pieces. This probably isn't too much of an issue, visually at least, since the epoxy is black, but it still helps make it adhere better if you take the time to scrape off the small bubbles that form on the surfaces below. So this is where everything stopped going smoothly. The epoxy cured so fast it was rock solid by the following morning, which was less than 24 hours. And for those with no experience using epoxy like this, that is super fast. Because of how fast it cured too, I ended up with this giant thing running through the middle of the table. And you can see it runs all the way through the table to where you can see the melamine from the mold peeking through from the bottom. Easy though, it's just a simple crack. So I'll just clean it up a little bit and pick at it, and I'll just fill it with some epoxy and it'll be fine. It'll all blend together. Yeah, so I'll just pick at this a little bit and just clean it right up. This is going great. Yeah, no, that. So the crack definitely goes further than what I can see. I thought this was going to be as easy as pouring some new epoxy into it, but I really just need to open it up and assess the full damage. Ah, shoot, I scratched it. Gonna have to fix that later. I like to stay positive when I run into problems like this one. There's no point, in my opinion, getting frustrated, especially when there is nothing I could do to change the outcome of how the epoxy cured. And on that note, it was my dumb mistake anyways that caused the crack to occur. What I could do, and what I will, of course, is learn from the mistake and take that into projects I work on in the future. That's something I like to do with all of my woodworking projects, and really is true in everything that I do. Getting frustrated typically doesn't solve any problems. It just makes them worse. And if there is ever a time to get frustrated or angry, it should be proportional to the consequence of the mistake. I'm sure there is already a technical term for this, but I'll call it emotional proportionality response, just for me. Whoa. I think my whoa there is about the max amount of frustration or reaction that should be expressed in a situation like this. Like, consider the consequences here. The best outcome, well, is this. I find a solution and can still create a great table. The worst possible outcome is that the table is ruined and it goes in the dumpster. It sucks. Yes. I'm out about $1,000 and a lot of time. And maybe I lose a little bit of my soul for wasting a piece of old growth redwood. But no one's dead, and I still have all my fingers. I'm sure there's some of you thinking, well, you're wasting old growth redwood anyways by throwing plastic into it. That's awesome. I'd love to hear your opinion. So leave a comment if you'd like to share your thoughts. So what I've been doing for the past 3 minutes of YouTube time is searching for a solution. I think the best way forward here is to flatten the slab and get it down to rough final dimensions. Then I can reevaluate the crack. At that point, I'll know exactly where the crack is, how far it extends, and what needs to be patched and what's good to go. So one reason the epoxy cracked while it cured was because it shrunk, which is a normal process for curing epoxy, but typically it's malleable enough from a slow cure that it doesn't crack. Along with the shrinkage though, it warped the entire table. That's why you saw me using those wedges in order to level it out. Then I could use my sled to flatten one side, flip it over, and do it all over again. I'm sure you don't want to watch me flatten this again, so to save you some time, I'll speed it up for you. YouTube, go. And while that's happening, I figured, we could talk about the weather or something, or I don't know, do you like the beaches or the mountains? Wait, why is it slowing down? Hey, what's going on? What was that? Well, I've done it again. Tried to rip away the rights that this table deserves to hold people's coffee and books they don't want to read anymore. All that to say, the bit came loose. That was really close. No, seriously, that was really close. First off, I was close to putting a hole straight through the table, and second, possibly having a 3-inch bit doubling out of the router at a couple thousand RPM. And since I was standing right next to it, I would prefer that not happening. Honestly though, it was time for that bit to go anyways. I could tell by how difficult it was getting to slide the router back and forth that the bit was getting really dull. So I replaced it with a bit that uses carbide inserts, which cut through this way better than the first one. Now that I've completely destroyed my shop and am going to spend the next 3 weeks getting sawdust out of my ears, I finally have a flattened table both top and bottom. It's time to move on, clean up the shop a little bit, and get to repairing my mistake. Maybe not in that order. Speaking of dust, before I cover up the bottom cracks to prevent leaking, it's important to blow all of the remaining dust out of the cracks. Remember earlier how we removed all the dirt and rotted wood and bark and stuff from the live edge? Well, same concept. It would be like trying to put duct tape on sand if I didn't clean it out. I guess duct tape can't really fix everything. Alright, on to the next bit of epoxy. Wish me luck this time. When you're mixing the epoxy, it'll start off a bit cloudy, and you can see these kind of wavy lines in the mixture. Cut to a few minutes of mixing later, and those lines that you see in the epoxy are gone. That's how you know your two parts are completely mixed together, and it's time to add your dye and start pouring. It should be pretty easy to match the colors here, saying it's just black, but I'm still trying to match it as close as possible. Believe it or not, there is a method to my madness here while I'm adding the dye. When I mix in dyes, I use my stir stick, even in the bigger batches, to gauge how far down I can see into the epoxy once all the dye is mixed in. During my original pour, I remember being able to see about a 1/4 inch down the stir stick, so I'm trying to match that as close as possible now. I think in this case, it would be better to go darker than lighter, So I'm also erring on the side of caution here and maybe going a little darker than what the original pour color was. Now that everything is going well, I'll hand it over to Shop Mark to explain more. So I got the table drying behind me. We're about 24 hours into the second pour, so filling up those cracks, and now it is actually working perfectly. The epoxy is curing, it's curing well, it's nice and gooey. This is exactly what we were looking for, and preferably what we were looking for the first time. Now we're just playing a waiting game. Gotta wait for it to cure, and then I can finally get to sanding. While that's curing, I think it's time to rewind a little bit. So back to how this table is a long time coming. I guess if I do my math right, it's about 4 years in the making. I started this table, well, I should say a table, with the legs. These legs were never actually meant for this epoxy table, but for a table made from a 4-inch thick Perota cookie. I wanted to keep the design of the legs relatively simple, since the main feature for this coffee table is the top. You saw my sketch there a second ago, but it's basically 4 legs with a slight camber and a middle cross section to hold it all together. The simple design made it very easy to mark everything out and get everything cut down to rough dimensions on my miter and table saw. With everything cut now to rough dimensions, I'm checking layout and size and making sure everything is shaping up how I want it to. At least, that's what I think. Sometimes I take these long time-lapse kind of shots and seriously wonder what's going through my head when I go back and look in the footage. Especially here. I have no headphones in, ear pro on, and nothing loud happening in my shop. I guess I just wanted to be super safe for a little bit. Wait, isn't that right where I started? Would you look at that? 45 minutes of deliberation to do a complete 360. It's like I have a drawing or something, and a plan, and I'm actually sticking to it. I decided to use ash for these table legs because of the bold, kind of in-your-face grain pattern, as well as the very basic color, which I understand are kind of juxtaposed to each other, but the design of these legs is relatively simple, so I figured the grain pattern would elevate the final look a little bit. I also haven't decided yet whether I want to stain the legs, and being that ash has a very consistent neutral color throughout, I knew it was a good choice for my indecisiveness. Ash is really strong too. The original table, that 4-inch thick Perota cookie, weighed in at about 60 pounds. Turns out it was a good idea to over-engineer these, since the redwood table weighs significantly more than the Perota table, mostly because of the epoxy. Redwood and Perota are actually very similar in weights, with Perota having a density of 26 pounds per cubic foot, and redwood with a density of 28 pounds per cubic foot. You know, if you were curious at all. I wasn't thrilled with what I was seeing with just the rough cuts and no visualization of the camber. Plus, I wanted to get a practice run in cutting the dominoes to make sure everything was going to fit together nicely. So I went ahead and made a little mock-up out of some 2x4s I had laying around. Based on this, I ended up cutting both the cross section and legs a little shorter than my original drawing. Once I was happy, I could move on to cutting the slots for the dominoes. I decided on dominoes because of ease and strength. You could use dowels here for sure, and could certainly use screws as well, but I didn't want to have to plug up the screw holes since those would be visible from the outer side of the legs, and I wanted to keep everything as clean as possible. Why did I think that was going to work? So I messed this up. Pretty bad. I don't really know how I thought it was going to work in the first place, especially with the couple of test pieces that I did. So let me show you what I did and what I'm going to do to fix it. So what I did was I cut the mortise to attach the center support piece to the leg first. This drilled the mortises so they were perpendicular to the attaching face of the supporting piece. Then I took it over to my table saw and cut the 15-degree angle that I wanted the legs to camber at. So my thought process here was that it was going to be a lot easier to cut the dominoes into a straight piece than it was an angled piece. And so I tested this out using a couple of pieces of 2x4s, which is what I was playing around with in order to get the sizing and everything right. And I was able to get those pieces together perfectly fine. But now taking a closer look, it's pretty clear that once I did cut the miter, the angles of the slots are off, which makes it impossible to join these together correctly. Because the 2x4s are made of pine and the wood's so soft, I was basically just able to force everything into place, unbeknownst that this definitely wasn't going to work once I cut everything into the ash. So I don't really remember what my thought process was when I was initially putting this together, but I'll revert back to my initial reaction of, why did I think that was going to work? What I needed to do was to cut the 15-degree angle first and then cut the mortises. This maintains the perpendicular nature of the mortise and tenons to the adjoining faces, and now I can slide them in to meet flush with each other. In reality, I also came to find out that it is very easy to cut a mortise using a domino tool on an angled piece of wood. Good thing, you'll learn something new every day. Now, because of the way I designed the center support section, I had plenty of extra wood to be able to cut off the mistake and cut in some new tenons. So after going through that process a second time, at least this thing is starting to look like a set of table legs. There's an additional feature to these legs as well that I can finally start working on. And you've seen the camber outwards, but I also wanted to add a taper to them from top to bottom. I wanted to add this taper since I thought the legs looked a little bit bland without it. It also matches the camber and gives another subtle bit of character and keeps the eyes moving upwards towards the main focal point of this piece of furniture, which is the tabletop. It was a relatively easy feature to add with just a couple of passes on the table saw using my tapering jig, which is always a plus, but it really elevates the look of the overall final piece. Okay, one more dry fit because you can never have too many dry fits, and time to sand. Nope, no glue up just yet. The reason I'm sanding before assembling the legs is simply because it's a lot easier to sand these flat legs without all of the corners. Here I can use my orbital sander on every single piece, where if I tried sanding after assembly, I could use my orbital sander on most of the piece, as demonstrated by my wife. But then I would have to sand all the corners where the orbital sander can't reach by hand. And simply put, I don't want to do that. Alright, now with the glue up all done, the legs still looked like they were missing something. Or like they'd been hitting up Ben & Jerry's a little too often and needed to go on a run. And by run, I mean a nice round over to smooth over the edges and make it look a little less chunky. Okay, that one's nice and all, but back to the correct tabletop. Uh-oh, here's Shopmark again, hopefully with some good news? So now that I'm actually looking at the table with the legs on it, I kind of want to add a little bit more shape to the bottom side of this table. So what I'm going to do is add a curved beveled edge around the entire thing. And I definitely don't have a router bit that's big enough to do this. So I used my CNC in order to make a jig that I can use with my router in order to add this beveled edge around the bottom. Okay, so still not sanding yet, but at least it's not bad news. You know, that is one of the nice things about doing a project that doesn't belong to anyone in particular. Doing client work is always great and challenges me in different ways, but sometimes it's nice to do what I want to do every now and again. I went into this project with a plan, of course, as I do with all of my projects, but I can also keep shaping this as I go however I like. Plus, there's no time restraint, which makes doing something like adding a giant beveled edge to a table possible. Maybe some of you watching right now are a little confused. I mean, do epoxy tables really suck? Well, maybe. I don't think I've done a good enough job explaining this, but this table is a prime example of what happens when an epoxy table cures and hardens too fast. A reason I think it did this was because the plastic sheeting I put over it to keep the dust out. I basically created a curing oven. See, epoxy is an exothermic reaction, meaning it produces heat while it cures, and too much heat will cause issues. Even though this pour was within the limits of the epoxy, the plastic sheet I put over it trapped the heat being produced by that exothermic reaction, causing it to cure way too fast. That's the part before where I said I didn't use my brain. I was so intent on solving one problem that I didn't think about any unintended consequences. Had I actually used my brain, I would have put a fan or something blowing on it to keep the air circulating, or just not use the sheet at all to allow the heat to escape into the shop. It would have been relatively easy, especially in a black epoxy table, to sand out the few specks of dust that would have landed in it. I should have absolutely known better, but a well-deserved lesson learned. So epoxy tables, they do suck. The life out of me. This was definitely a project full of challenges, setbacks, and lots of time. But in the end, it was well worth the effort to turn this old-growth redwood into a beautiful table, ready to be the center of conversation and some good coffee. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, we would love your support. Go check out the rest of our videos from Vetere Custom Woodworks, and if you'd like to know when we release the next one, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.